Okay, so moving on to our first exam question. We have the diagram shows the structure of two alpha glucose molecules. So as you can see, H is at the top, and because alpha has a H in it, that means we've got two alpha glucose molecules there, just checking. On the diagram, draw a box around one chemical group in each glucose molecule used to form a glycosidic bond. Okay, so this is sort of tracking back to what we looked at in our last lesson, but we did cover in today's lesson as well. We've got two alpha glucose molecules over here. We know that a glycosidic bond is going to form between these two alpha glucose molecules. Where is it going to form? It says draw around the chemical group, one in each of these alpha glucose molecules. So we know that this is going to form a glycosidic bond. But the question says one chemical group in each glucose molecule. So we're going to use that fact um, to draw our boxes. So it's going to be between the OH group and the OH group. That's why you have to draw a box around. Okay, because the chemical bond is being formed between the OH of one alpha glucose and the OH of the other alpha glucose, forming a glycosidic bond, releasing a molecule of water in a condensation reaction. Here's what the mock scheme says. Again, OH, OH. It does say accept a box drawn around any OH and H from another OH. So ideally, it was saying maybe you could have drawn this and this as well. But just to be safe, it says chemical group. And H is not really a chemical group. That's why I drew a box around both OHs. Okay, next question. Now, they do love these sorts of questions. It's a sort of application-based content question, which sort of gets a lot of people. So it's really important that we have some practice at these types of questions. So lactulose is a disaccharide formed from one molecule of galactose and one molecule of fructose. Other than both being disaccharides, give one similarity and one difference between the structures of lactulose and lactose. So lactulose is a disaccharide. It's formed from galactose and fructose. So if we were to write that in a chemical reaction form, we've got galactose and we've got fructose, and that's forming lactulose, and it will also form water. Okay. We need to compare one similarity and one difference between the structures of lactulose and lactose. Now, because lactulose is a disaccharide, we know in terms of structure that both lactose and lactulose are going to have as a similarity. Both of them are disaccharides, which means both of them are formed from two monosaccharides, which means a condensation reaction must have occurred. And therefore, in terms of structure, both disaccharides are going to contain a glycosidic bond. Okay, so that's our first similarity. So both disaccharides are going to contain a glycosidic bond. Okay. And then the difference. Well, what's the difference? Well, we've written out the chemical reaction over here. Galactose reacting with fructose produces lactulose and water. What's in lactose? We're comparing lactulose to lactose. Well, lactose is formed from glucose and galactose. And that's going to form lactose and water. So there's our difference. Over here, we had fructose, but over here we have glucose. Okay, so we know that lactulose contains fructose, but lactose contains glucose. Okay, so lactulose contains fructose. And just an exam tip, in these situations, always write the converse as well, the opposite as well, because sometimes they can be really picky with mark schemes. Lactulose contains fructose, whereas lactose contains glucose. Okay. Here's the mock scheme. So similarity, both contain galactose or a glycosidic bond. So you could have also had that. As you could have seen over here, we had galactose over here and we had galactose reacting over here. Both of them have the same monomers. So you could have said as a similarity, both contain galactose, but we said glycosidic bond. I think that's always a safe one. Lactulose contains fructose, whereas lactose contains glucose, which we have. Yeah. Okay. Next question. Again, they love asking questions like these, and these are simple knowledge retrieval questions. So you don't want to be messing up marks on these sorts of questions. Okay, glycogen and cellulose are both carbohydrates. Describe two differences between the structure of a cellulose molecule and a glycogen molecule. Well, first up, what we looked at today, glycogen and starch are made up of alpha glucose monomers, whereas cellulose is made up of beta glucose monomers. Okay, so again, make sure you write down the opposite as well, because sometimes you won't be given the mark. Okay, so cellulose is made of beta glucose monomers, whereas we'll be dealing with, whereas glycogen is made from alpha glucose monomers. Okay, now what other difference do they have? Well, it says between the structure of a cellulose molecule. So we know that glycogen is a branched structure, whereas cellulose has a straight structure. Okay, and that's what I'm going to write as my second difference. Okay, so glycogen forms a highly branched structure, whereas cellulose forms straight chain polymer. Okay, so that's what we need to be writing. Looking at the mark scheme, I'm just going to get rid of my writing. Okay, we have cellulose is made up of beta glucose and glycogen is made up of alpha glucose. Notice here, compared to our mark scheme before, this wasn't strict with opposites, but this one, because it's saying differences, it is really strict with the sort of converse. So cellulose is made up of glycogen, and you could have had an and or whereas, as long as you're showing a comparison, it doesn't really matter which word you're using. And cellulose has a straight chain and glycogen is branch. We said point one and point two. You could have also had cellulose has a straight chain and glycogen is coiled. Glycogen has 1 to 4 and 1 to 6 glycosidic bonds, whereas cellulose has only 1 to 4 glycosidic bonds. Okay, moving on. Next question, we have starch is a carbohydrate often stored in plants. Describe and explain two features of starch that make it good for storage. Again, this is a question that is a retrieval question. And remember the red point that I highlighted on the slide. Whenever it asks about features that make it useful, the first point that you should always be writing down is insoluble, so it doesn't affect the water potential. So insoluble, therefore, doesn't affect the water potential. Okay, now that will have one mark in the bag. Another feature of starch, well, we saw that it has a branch, it's branched, same as glycogen. And because it's branched, that means that it can, if it's branched, it has a more hydrolysis um, for release of glucose. So rapid hydrolysis to glucose. So it has a branch structure for rapid hydrolysis back to glucose. Okay, looking at the mark scheme. So insoluble, so doesn't affect water potential, always one mark. We said it was branched. So it says accept branch, so glucose is readily released, which we have said. Rapid hydrolysis back to glucose. You could have also said that glucose is used in respiration. This is basically what we've said over here, this point over here. Rapid hydrolysis happens by enzymes. Or to have a safe one, you could have said the compact point over there. Okay, describe the structure of glycogen. Just because of time, I'm just going to skip this question. You can have a look at the mark scheme over here. Simple retrieval question. It's a polysaccharide of alpha glucose, or polymer of alpha glucose, and it is joined by glycosidic bonds, or it has a branched structure. Okay, suggest how glycogen acts as a source of energy. Remember, I will cover this now over here. We've looked at this. One of the adaptations of glycogen is that it forms a highly branched structure for rapid hydrolysis back to glucose. So we're going to write that down. So it has a branched structure for rapid hydrolysis back to glucose. And then how does it act as a source of energy? So this is a bit different. How does it act as a source of energy? Well, it acts as a source of energy because the glucose which is formed over here is used in respiration. The glucose is used in respiration. And you need to say that whenever we're talking about glucose, just put in respiration there as well. It would never be negatively marked. But glucose is always used in respiration. And normally that's a point that mock schemes have and a point that people very much ignore. Okay, so hydrolyzed, so glucose is used in respiration. Okay, now we did have two more questions, but because of timing, I'm just going to put the mock scheme on. So it says structure of starch molecule is different to the structure of a cellulose molecule. Again, we've covered this enough today. Starch is formed from alpha glucose, but cellulose is formed from beta glucose. And the position of the hydrogen and hydroxyl groups on carbon 1 is inverted. So as you can see, in beta glucose, the H is at the bottom, the OH is at the top. In alpha glucose, the H is at the top, the OH is at the bottom. You can see that in the two polymers, the two groups are inverted. Okay, and then explain how cellulose molecules are adapted for that function in plant cells. Again, you're just describing the structure of cellulose. They have long, straight chains. They are linked by hydrogen bonds, which collectively provide strength. And the structure which is formed is known as a fibril.